So, of all the different technologies that we talk about during the Enlightenment, the one that really probably has the most significant direct impact on the arts has got to be photography. And photography is something that isn't entirely new. We have seen variations on this historically. For example, the camera obscura, which was really a box that was used as a way to help artists transfer an image, a visual image, into a drawn surface. But this was not a permanent effect. You know, it was really something that was caused by optics, and it was a very temporary thing. You just basically could see it and trace it, etc. And so the real challenge during the 19th century that several people undertook was attempting to take that principle and capture it onto a surface. And the early forms of photography that we see and talk about are very, very, very different than what photography looks like today, or even in the last the last several decades. Of course, we've had the advent of the digital camera, and that, of course, has changed things dramatically. But even prior to that, with the typical film camera, technology had really come a long, long, long way from where photography had its origins. The early forms of photography were incredibly convoluted and complex and difficult and involved all sorts of nasty chemicals and incredibly long exposure times. And it was not something that could be done easily by the layperson. It was really something that required someone with a fair amount of skill and knowledge and material and process in order to make it work. So, of all the people that we really associate with the early photography processes, probably the best known is Daguerre. Louis-Jacques Daguerre is the man that we most closely credit with being one of the first people to really take this transitory effect and make it rendered into a permanent image. He actually partnered with another man named Nicéphore Niepce, who died in 1833. So their partnership was actually really kind of short, but he was also rather important in this whole process in developing how to how to make the image a permanent image. Daguerre's history is kind of interesting. He was originally he studied architecture, but then he was a stage designer in Paris, and he was very interested in lighting, and so he was really very, very knowledgeable when it came to setting up lighting and lighting effects and scenes, etc. He did a lot of that for operas and theaters in Paris, and this is certainly something that had a tremendous impact on his ability to create and develop a camera as we know it today. So he worked hard at trying to find a way to freeze the image that could be created by a camera obscura. And again, working with Nicéphore Niepce, he managed to find some pretty important advances towards this end. But it was really an accident that finally solved the problem that they had. They were managing to create kind of a latent image, but it wasn't until they accidentally broke a mercury thermometer and the mercury vapor actually managed to let that latent image develop. He had put a piece into that he'd exposed, a plate. He'd put it into a cupboard. There was a broken thermometer in there. The mercury let it develop. He pulled it out and found the latent image. And so after figuring that out, they were able to reproduce it and refine the process. Initially, it took about 8 hours to expose an image onto a plate, but with some work and refining, they got it down to about 30 minutes. And of course, you think about this is a really long time to pose for any sort of image. Some early images of people, photographs that you'll see of people, sometimes they have a funny-looking metal brace. This was coming up behind them to support their heads so that they could hold perfectly still for the length of time it took for one of these images to be developed. So he did figure out how to develop these images, but it took him a longer time, till about 1837, before he found a way to fix them and make them stay. And so they were no longer light fast, so they were light fast rather. Previous to this, the additional exposure to light would continue to impact the film, and so that simply just didn't work. The other thing that's interesting too about these early images, these daguerreotypes, they were done on metal plates, and they were a single copy, and they were also a mirror image of what you had intended to photograph. So you can often tell if something is a direct image like this, like a daguerreotype, because for men, the buttons will be on the wrong side of their coat. It isn't until a little later that we see the invention of a negative process, which is where someone takes an image, creates a negative, and is able to create additional copies from that. The daguerreotype was a single shot deal. You made one and that's all you got. You couldn't make additional images from it. So, and that's one of the drawbacks. Of course, the really long exposure time is also a problem. But they are beautiful images. They are very fragile. But daguerreotypes also give you very sharp and clear detail if they're done, with again, if you have the right amount of exposure time, etc. So the image that we're looking at here is a still life that Daguerre created in his studio. And still lives like this were, of course, quite appropriate for a daguerreotype because nothing in there is going to move. But this is a very, very, very early example, an image here that we can see of what this early photographic process looked like. So the image that we're looking at here is an example of a different type of photographic process than the earlier daguerreotype. This is what's known as an albumin print. And albumin is basically egg white. And so what we're looking at here is something that was actually created by a combination of people, by Eugene Dellacroix and Eugene Dellacroix. And of course we know Dellacroix from our study of Romanticism. Well, Dellacroix, like other artists from the period, many of them were really interested in this photographic process. And Dellacroix in particular would arrange and pose models and set them up to create, these compositions. You'll notice this one's quite a bit later. This is, 1854, and so the process has had quite a bit of time to be refined. And one of the major changes here is that this process we're looking at is based upon something that was developed by a man named Talbot, which is called a calotype. And so a calotype is different than a daguerreotype. With a calotype, you would actually expose the image onto a piece of paper that had been treated with silver nitrate and other chemicals. And what we ended up getting was actually a negative, a reverse of the image. But then you could use this to create additional exposures and come up with a positive image. And so this process was really the first negative printing process. And using a negative, by the way, really this is the ancestor of what became the standard, for example, 35mm camera that was so popular before digital photography came about. So this process, though, allowed the artist to create multiples from the same image. It was also a much faster exposure time. So the image that we're looking at here was by Johnson, Hawes, and Hawes and Southworth. And this is early operation under the ether from Massachusetts General Hospital. And these guys are here in an operating theater. And you'll notice it is a daguerreotype. And you can also see that the majority of the figures here, their faces are kind of a little fuzzy. And this is really because of the fact that they had to hold still for this incredibly long period of time while the image was taken. But what's interesting, though, is there's one figure here who's really quite sharp, and that's the woman on the bed because she's unconscious. Again, as she's about to have a surgery done, she's under the influence of ether. So the image here was actually taken by two guys, as I mentioned previously, by Hawes and Southworth. And Hawes was a painter, and Southworth was actually a pharmacist. And they put together a studio in Boston and worked to develop techniques that would make the exposure time faster and work on refining the process. But again, they basically began with the daguerreotype. And the first daguerreotypes actually were in the United States were taken within 2 months of the unveiling of the process in France. So it spread very, very, very quickly. So another key figure in early photography, and one who we'll continue to talk about a little bit in the next chapter, is a guy by the name of Nadar. And so Nadar, his full name actually was Gaspard Félix Tournachon, but he was just known as Nadar. It was kind of his nom de plume, I guess you could say. But he was a well-known caricaturist, a novelist, a journalist, and a balloonist. And the balloonist part's kind of important because he's the first person ever to do an aerial photograph. He would actually go up in his balloon, and he took pictures of the city of Paris from up above. He photographed a lot of really famous people, including Dellacroix, Damier, Courbet, and Manet. And these are guys that we'll be talking about in particular in the next chapter. He also he utilized another further refinement. He used a wet plate process, which replaced the original Calotype. And this made, you know, some additional technical advantages for him. One of the things he had to do, though, was create a portable darkroom. So he would actually go up in his balloon with a whole portable darkroom in order to create and develop his images. So one of the best known examples of the use of photography from this period certainly has to be the work of Timothy O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan is well known to us because of his historical documentation of the Civil War. And this begins to really show some of the potential power of the photograph as a journalistic tool. He was a guy who took some incredibly powerful pictures, like the one we see here, taken at Gettysburg. And you can see these dead men who have their pockets turned out and their boots have been stolen. Sullivan actually received some pretty harsh criticism because some people actually believe that he arranged the corpses of some of these men in order to make the imagery that much more dramatic.